Hello, Ruth Myers here. Thank you for attending. Our next discussion here will be about people with autism, or as some people with autism prefer to be described, autistic people. I will use both terms in an effort to be equally respectful and hopefully only half offensive. I'm wanting to, of course, refer to people in the way they would prefer to be referred. I'm also going to focus today not only on some of the traditional definitions of autism, but on what seems to be an emerging issue of misdiagnosis or errors in people with a diagnosis of autism. And it's become a little bit of a crusade here. And, Ruth, why are your shorts in such a bunch about this particular issue? And one of the first people that made me think really hard about this is a little dude being the medical term that was used in all his reports, I'm sure. No, I'm kidding. He was described, David, at age 6 years old as having severe autism. And he had wonderful parents, lovely parents, who took him to the local autism research center to be evaluated. They spent a little time with David and proclaimed that he had severe autism. They proclaimed this when he was about 3 years old, and they said the only hope for him to have any kind of quality of life was if he would get their at that point, very expensive ABA-style programming in his home and later at school. So his parents paid out of pocket for 5 to 6 hours of behavior analysis technician interaction in their home or at school. And at this point, there was not an entitlement in the state that he lived in. And after 3 years, nothing had changed. And the parents had brought up this question a few times, why this doesn't seem to be making any difference. And they unfortunately got the response of, well, you got to do it more, or you're doing it wrong. At no point did anybody say, did we miss something? So I got to tell you, I had guys on my team, behaviorists and other guys on my team that had supernatural magic powers with children. I respect that. I sure don't have it. We had a guy, I'll call him Bernie because that was his name, who whenever he was within the same zip code as a little kid, they would jump over buildings and vault the furniture to go snuggle up with Bernie because he had those supernatural magic powers with children. I don't. So I was very surprised when this little dude, David, as soon as we met him, he leaps into my lap and he starts goofing around. He's like playful, cheerful, affectionate, has no ritualistic activities at all. He's clearly enjoying the engagement. He clearly feels really comfortable with it. He was playful, he was clever, and at that moment, he had no characteristics of people with autism. He was comfortable with all this snuggling with somebody like me who doesn't have, cupcake unicorn magic dust. So I said, what is this a result of all that therapy you've been doing for all these years? And the parents said, oh no, he's always been like that. But you'll see the autism. So after 45 minutes of basically hanging out with this incredibly snuggly, affectionate child, he slides out of my lap and slides down onto the floor and starts engaging in a sequence of very unusual physical movements. And as you watched him, you could see he was pressing his joints against the floor. He was pulling on his wrists, pulling on his knees, twisting his neck, flapping really, really hard. And he was whimpering at the same time. And the parents said, see, that's the autism. Is autism an intermittent condition? No. Now, what I didn't tell you was that during this 3 years, when the parents were utterly 100% invested in doing what they knew they had to do to be good parents, they had lost their home, paying for this therapy. They'd lost their jobs because they had to be present all the time. They'd lost all of their family relationships and friendships because they had to be 100% David 100% of the time. And they were living in a one-room studio because they could no longer afford to live in a home that had bedrooms. And that was because every bit of money and time they had gone into ABA style programming in their home, which, according to their observations, had not even made any difference. Yet they knew they had to do that for this child. So, how in the world did anybody even come around to a diagnosis of autism with this child? Well, the clinicians had seen him just for those few minutes when he was so miserable, when he was disengaged, and when he was managing himself with some pretty unusual looking physical movements. However, they had not observed him in any other setting. It turned out that this little dude had a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which causes loosening of the joints. And as you probably know, loose joints, after a while, hurt the same as stiff arthritic joints. So what he would do every so often would be to twist and turn and pressure and push on himself to basically relieve pain. So proper evaluation by an Ehlers-Danlos syndrome expert, some braces, some pain meds, and a new bed cured every symptom that looked even remotely autistic. Now, obviously the child did a bajillion% better, but look at what the family went through when they were forced into this very expensive tunnel. And at no point did anybody say, what do we miss here? Until they ended up seeing the little team that I used to work on. So part of the reason I think this is especially important now is that a lot of people who only have a few vague, non-interfering, autistic-like symptoms are getting the diagnosis of autism. And you can understand how that happens and why that happens. It triples a person's developmental disability benefits in many parts of the country, which is not a bad place to start in terms of why a person might want to acquire a diagnosis. But the outcomes tend to be very skewed, because if people who don't really have autism get a lot of autism therapy, it either makes things a million times worse, or the person gets better, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the autism treatment. So the people with the most severe forms of autism, and many of them are my colleagues and friends, really resent the resources being diverted to people that don't have the same needs that they do. So what's the classic definition of autism? And I believe it's worth remembering this particular definition, because if people deviate a lot from this definition, that almost always means we've missed something. So what are the criteria? I bet we could all recite them together, right? A person has a neurologically based sensory integration alteration, which means, and we've talked in other seminars, the amygdala and the attached structures, the limbic structures in the brains of people with autism are unusually shaped and unusually sensitive. In addition, the connectivity between all the parts of the brain is much greater in people with autism. So that leads to sensitivities in all the senses, and it also leads to a need for people to manage all that sensitivity as they go about their day in ordinary situations. That sensitivity makes it very hard to engage with people. Whereas you might notice another person's cologne, for the person with autism, that cologne may cause them to feel like they're going to suffocate right on the spot, for example. And there's many other parts of social reciprocity. Dr. Temple Grandin, that is a wonderful teacher for so many people, who is a professor of animal husbandry in Colorado, where I practiced for many years. So I got a chance to get to know her. She would talk about the longing to have warm, affectionate hugs with her mother, who's a wonderful person. However, when the hugs actually happened, she thought she'd die. That is the paradox of sensory input for people with autism oftentimes. People with autism are sometimes described as being happier alone, but that's a little bit of a mistake. People with autism are interested in connection just as much as anybody else, and they suffer terribly with loneliness. However, there are ways to move past that and develop those kinds of connections that anybody wants. And my friends and neighbors, particularly at AutCom, if you don't know AutCom, you gotta know AutCom, talk about the ways to obtain those relationships in life and to really thrive in the context of those relationships. AutCom stands for the Autism National Committee, and I'm a life member. 2/3 to 3/4 of the people on the board at AutCom are people with, no doubt about it, traditionally, classically described autism. And as you might imagine, it's an extraordinary thing to sit in the room with a group of people with the more severe, more obvious forms of autism and watch all the ways they succeed. It's the best learning experience anybody could have. People with autism, because of these sensitivities, are described sometimes as stiff, unaffectionate little babies and children, or they crave a lot of holding and squeezing. Unusual movements and gestures, the flapping, the rocking, the walking on toes, often are described as intrinsic to autism, but that's not quite the whole story. Let's talk about it in a minute. People will have sensory cravings and aversions. And people, because so much energy goes into everyday life and planning for the next sensory onslaught, that routine and sameness is a great comfort for many people. Just, I know exactly how much sensory onslaught I'm going to have to deal with if my schedule is the way I plan it. So, if a person has autism, what should we be aware of? I'm sure you've all heard the old saying that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. People with autism are not carbon copies of each other by any means. There are some consistent features that are worth considering as you try and develop a friendship or other relationship with a person who has autism. If we can be aware of those consistent features, then we can more readily recognize when something happens that probably has nothing to do with autism. It's probably something else. So let's talk a little bit about brain parts, brain chemicals, body chemicals, common complications, and other stuff. This says how the brain works. As I mentioned before, the amygdala, which is a very important doodad right in the middle of the brain, that has to do with fear, rage, anxiety, recklessness, and certain other intense emotions, without much modulation from other parts, unless the other parts are active, can produce, if activated or if overactivated and not modulated, can cause reckless activities. And we've all heard the stories of people with autism that walk on the ledge and don't have any fear about it, or anxiety attacks. Now, this is one of the things we talked about, the connectiveness between all the nerve cells in the brain. There's a lot of sensory bleed, is one way to put it. Sensory reactions to emotional input. So a person will say, "I love you," and the person with autism may have the sense that their skin is burning, or they're starting to taste apple pie, or some other sensory reaction to that emotional input. People also will have emotional reactions to sensory input. So flipping that around, right? The person sees a pink garment and they have an emotion of feeling despondent or happy or silly. And it's not just association, but in fact is a very direct connection. So the emotional and sensory responses tend to be very intense. People also will describe abrupt episodes, paroxysms of emotions of fear, anxiety, and anger in response to fairly innocuous sensory input. There was one gal I worked with until we were able to offer her some treatment options. She would fly into a rage anytime she was presented with a food that was round. You could just imagine the amazingness of the support staff that were able to figure that out. Round food, round-shaped food would trigger a rage. No other input. So we're talking no apples, no round pancakes, no, for a long, long time, until we found a treatment that helped settle that particular circuit in her brain. Sometimes people with unusually shaped amygdalas, in fact, develop amygdaloid seizures. These occur much more often in people with autism, and they are not detectable with standard surface EEG. In the section where we talk about unusual seizures, we talk about deep lead EEG, which is a kind of a scary looking diagnostic procedure, probably not necessary, but it can be done if people are really, really needing the information. That's the only way to find the seizure waveform in people with amygdaloid seizures. These are a partial seizure, so the person is fully conscious when these are happening, and the person will have abrupt, intense, completely unexplained, untriggered episodes of terror, destructiveness, self-mutilation, or rages. The person is conscious while this is going on, leading a lot of people to think that they're doing it on purpose, but they aren't. And any reasonably competent behavior analyst would be able to tell you, well, he's not getting anything out of this. And in fact, it blows up some of his favorite things to do, so not behavioral. And it's out of the person's control. But many people will have a little bit of memory for what happens. So they have this horrifying feeling of watching themselves destroy things or hurt people and being pretty much powerless to stop it. Some people will try. They can feel them coming on, for example, this type of seizure, and they will do some very, very unusual things to try and mitigate the seriousness of the seizure. Unfortunately, sometimes those things that people do are misinterpreted as off-task behavior or resistant behavior or uncooperative behavior. One seminar I was in, there was a gal who told the story about this guy who was described as having task avoidance in the bathroom. As they got to know him, they realized that he could feel when one of these violent seizures was coming on, and so he'd take himself into the bathroom and lock the door. And then when he was sufficiently recovered, he'd come back out. For a long time, people kept trying to interrupt that, but every time they did, he'd fly into a rage, which they also misinterpreted as resistive behavior, when in fact for him it was a seizure that he was trying to prevent injuring people by locking himself up in a bathroom. Think about it. Do you know people that when some kind of spell is coming on, they kind of do things to try and restrict their movements or get away? Not uncommonly, of course, misinterpreted as resistance or what have you, uncooperativeness. There's also a tendency for synesthesias. So people will have unusual sensory experiences that compound ordinary sensory experiences. One fellow I knew, for example, if he tasted a certain flavor of tea, he also had the sense that he was hearing music. Synesthesia's interconnectedness that doesn't exist for people without the connectivity that occurs in the brains of people with autism. And there's two other common complications for people with autism that have more to do with the system than they have to do with neurology. One of them is that people with autism, because the world is so painfully toxic a lot of the time, are anxious a lot of the time. And that kind of anxiety, that fear, causes a number of complications in a person's life. And the second thing, and we have to constantly be on the alert for this, there's still an awful lot of so-called treatment options or behavior plans that are specifically designed to make people with autism pretend they don't have autism. What a horrifying message to give to a little kid with autism that's just trying to live his life. And by the way, we want you to hide all those coping strategies and pretend you're just like this other kid. What a terrible message. Whatever you are, it's not okay. Even though it's been well documented for decades that if people trying to educate people with autism learn the person's communication and endorse their ways of coping and learning, people do better in the long run. People with autism who get to do it their way do better. So why is it that anybody keeps fighting with them to try and make them invisible? That's no fun. I mean, for goodness sake. So what are some of the things people with autism do to resist this incredible firestorm of input and stimuli? Well, some people resist certain sensory input, and those are the people that stay very clear people. There's one gal, she was the subject actually of a Oscar-winning documentary, Autism is a World, and she and I have been presenters at conferences together, and she was brilliant in the documentary. When you visit with her, you can't go closer than 5 feet. She waves you away. That's one of the ways she protects herself. She's not being rude. She's just saying, any closer than that and I can't breathe. Other people will wear sunglasses all the time. Other people will have headphones all the time, just to attenuate all that sensory input. People also, and this is part of what distinguishes people with autism from many other people with sensory issues, is that many people with autism find something they can flood themselves with. And of all things, that movie, the Accountant, of all things, if you remember that movie, the actor whose name escapes me right at this moment spent a ton of time with people with autism to try and get how they cope. And there's a scene where he's very wound up, he's very uncomfortable, and he starts cranking this very kind of aggressive music and grinding on himself. And he does that for a certain number of minutes, and that helps reset all of the input. Ben Affleck, thank you very much. And that to me was a really nice, kind of an educational moment. It also would be nice if everybody with autism got to have superhuman math skills and memory and stuff like that. He put that part in there because that's part of the story. That's not ubiquitous at all, is it? But that was a nice little bit, wasn't it, in that part of the movie showing sensory flooding as a coping strategy. People will resist certain emotional input. There's this one fellow I saw, wonderful man, wonderful family, and in a visit, I just let it spill. I said, you know what, Michael? I just love your family. And he froze. I'm like, oh, Ruth, bad thing. You shouldn't have done that. 2 years later, Michael came up to me and said, love you too. 2 years, that's how long it took him to process that really excessive input from me. It was my mistake, wasn't it? But at least he knew it came from a good place. I wasn't trying to hurt him. And that's one of the other astonishing things about most people I know with autism, is that people do make a lot of mistakes. However, they tend to be enormously forgiving. Not all, of course, but remarkably so. As long as the rest of us that don't have the privilege of thinking like they do, at least try to do better. Some people with autism find it helpful to filter or alter input. The most common example is people that look at the spinning fans and then do like this. Sometimes that means migraine headache. Sometimes it means I'm filtering the spinning input. Or people will listen to the static, when you used to be able to do that, on between TV stations. You can do it with radios now, I'm told. I bet nobody in this room remembers when you could look at test patterns and listen to static on a TV, right? Did I just date myself again? Yeah. And people will find ways to hypnotize themselves. It's a kind of a meditation that helps them go in, go deep, and shut it all out for a little while. And when other people roll with that, just respect that the person's doing what they need to do, the quality of life and function improves, which flies in the face of, some of what's been said and published is that you must force X, Y, Z, and Q on these little kids with autism for there to be any hope of a reasonable life. That's pretty much the opposite of what the real outcomes data and evidence show. So this is a not colorful brain. If you've been to any of the other seminars, you'll notice that this is not as colorful as the other brains I've showed you. And I just mention this because it shows that amygdala, that little doodad, and you can see there's a lot of important brain real estate right there. You got your pituitary gland with all your hormones and so forth. You've got your mood centers, you've got your perception centers, you've got your sensory centers. All of that interconnects right in that little tiny, densely packed bit of brain real estate, which is a lot more hooked together in people with the more traditionally defined autism. So you say to yourself, well, if the problem is irritability in the brain, interconnectivity to the point where it's painful, and irritability in the amygdala per se, what happens? Well, we've talked about a lot of it. We're also going to talk about some late medical complications that can occur as a result of basically this ongoing intense activation. One of the early symptoms, and one that persists for many people with autism their whole lives, is a really hard time getting to sleep. Many times parents of little kids with autism will say this is one of the most challenging and vexing symptoms, is that my child never sleeps or hardly ever sleeps, or I never can predict when they're going to sleep. So what are the complications of an expanded definition of autism? And some people call it autism spectrum disorder, where people have a few autistic-like characteristics, and that immediately qualifies them for autism services, which tend to be very spendy, which, we're clinicians. I don't care how much it costs. If it's $1 bajillion, that's great, as long as it works. However, unfortunately, this expanded definition of autism covers a lot of people where they don't really meet the core criteria. They got some other reason to look a little like they have autism. We'll talk about those other conditions in a minute. But autism awareness, I think it's great, as long as the autism awareness takes the form of, oh, we like this diversity. We like that this person with autism gets to be however they are, wherever they are, and where they want to be. Unfortunately, it gets to be more like everybody ought to be Bill Gates or Albert Einstein, who are thought to have autism spectrum disorder. Every unusual thing that Elon Musk does is now being categorized as a symptom of autism spectrum disorder ever since he proclaimed to the world that he has Asperger's syndrome, which is now categorized as autism spectrum disorder. When in fact there's a lot of stuff he does that doesn't have anything to do with having anything in the autism family, right? People start to value their data more than their people. So the people that don't really have very many challenges related to autism start to look great when you do just a little bit of programmatic support, but mostly environmental support. The people that have much greater needs, more intensive modifications of their living environments, much more intensive communication supports and what have you, those people don't make the graphs look very good. So the people over here with the cookbook saying, this is the cure for autism, start to get data that are not very impressive, So to keep selling the book, they start firing the people that might need the support the most, because those people don't make their outcomes data look very good. And I think many of us sadly have seen this exact sequence. The diagnostic mimics get missed, biggest complication of all. And a whole lot of people who don't know anything get to call themselves experts in autism. I am the autism expert. Well, how did you come around to doing that? And do any people with autism agree with you? AutCom has a fabulous orientation protocol, and one of the things they maintain is a wonderful library of first-person communications by people with autism, either dictated communications to somebody who could write, or their own writing, or some other way of communicating. It's pretty staggering to see what those people say really does help versus what's been perpetrated upon them. I think that the other, generalization, I am a gigantic fan of Shami. Some of you may have already heard of Shami. Actually, now in his newest books, he goes by his given name, which is Shandima. He doesn't go by Shami anymore now that he's over 30. But when he was about 16 years old, his parents were told he will never have any meaningful consciousness or awareness of life. The nicest thing you can do for him and your family is to put him away in a facility and never see him again. He's a fellow with a more classically defined type of autism and communicates without speech. And at that point, he was thought to not communicate at all. Well, he was offered as a bridge, not as a final, but as a bridge. He was offered to try a controversial tool called facilitated communication, where his mother and others would steady his hand over a keyboard. And he typed and he typed. And then after some time of that, nobody steadied his arm anymore. And he started to type independently. And this is the kind of stuff that happened, the stuff you see here. He turned out to be a poet. And I made the grave tactical error of being the second presenter at a conference where Shami was the first presenter. And it was just extraordinary and also remarkable how easily everybody just adapted. So still doesn't use spoken communication, types completely independently. So people, he would have a typed presentation that somebody would read to the audience, and then people would ask him questions, and he would type answers. It was just brilliant, and everybody was right into it right away. And everything he said was this kind of stuff. Now that's brilliant for Shami, but wouldn't it be awful if somebody was over here saying, well, that's just an autism thing? No, it isn't. It's a Shami thing. He's a brilliant poet. He's published several books now, and he and his mother run a foundation in Sri Lanka where he grew up. The other thing along those same lines is dismissing a talent a person has as some kind of savant skill party trick, when in fact it may be something the person really values and is unique to that person. The second thing is how people get on sort of a treasure hunt with people with autism. Oh, let's figure out your savant skill. Gives people an awful message, doesn't it? Yeah, you're only interesting if you can, tell me what day of the week it was on September 12th, 1942, or what have you. So the other generalizations that come when people get to generalize, peculiar dietary needs. Dietary issues and allergies are indeed much more common in people with autism. but they're not seen in every single person with autism. Hidden artistic talents or skills. And again, I return to this, I think, grave error of saying that people with autism should spend their time and energy pretending not to have autism. And there's another implicit issue that I think bubbles up as people try and support a person with autism, is this idea that, well, we respect your autism, we value your autism. They expect the person to feel the same way back. Well, because I've been treated so well with my autism, that means I will automatically be a nice, generous, open-hearted person myself. The freedom to be a jerk. Well, let's talk about Evan, 46-year-old guy with autism, had this amazing talent with making people look really good, haircuts, styling. He just had a particularly brilliant skill at that. So everybody's saying, well, of course, salon, off you go, right? But he didn't work out too well there. Well, I went to see him at the salon, and this is what he said. Well, Ruth, you're fat, probably stupid, and everyone knows women shouldn't be doctors. Wonder why I didn't do too well at the salon, right? There's this, and this is not confined to people with autism, there's this idea of the permitted personalities of people with various syndromes and conditions. And there is an idea that people with autism should be particularly understanding and tactful and diplomatic. Why? It's like the same people that say everybody with Down syndrome is sweet and adorable. Why? It's not true. They might have skills and they might not. But even more important is if we want to offer a person a formulation that they have autism, we probably ought to get on the right track in terms of making that assessment. So the first step is to look at the person carefully, spend time with that person. Almost everybody I know who's been provided a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, but doesn't really meet core criteria, well, their responses are interesting. I say, you've got this diagnosis of autism. Do you think it's true? And most of the time people say, no, but it makes them feel good. Seeing the person for good prolonged periods of time in multiple settings, or absolutely obtaining the observations of other people that see that person in multiple settings, combined with skilled, structured, and unstructured interviewing. Now, unstructured interviewing, that sounds really, sophisticated, doesn't it? All that means is hang out with the person when they're not feeling like they're under a microscope. You get to know people better that way, don't you? I'm thinking. And a comprehensive evaluation for psychiatric and other medical mimics. So over the years, I've been very, very fortunate to have the chance to do a lot of unique, what's called comprehensive assessments of people that were thought to be challenging. So a slightly selected demographic, people with intellectual and or developmental disabilities, or if you're in Pennsylvania, people with intellectual disabilities or autism, who are thought to be challenging or challenged in some way. And over the years, because I have this little tiny researcher gland that I didn't know I had, we gather data, lots and lots of data. I will spare you the big old charts with all the numbers. I will say, however, that if we separate out the people who had autism, we found that 90% of those people had co-occurring health problems that were not being treated. Sometimes they were known and not treated on purpose for all kinds of hard to fathom reasons. Most of the time, they simply hadn't been diagnosed. 87% had experienced severe trauma, usually abuse, often in the name of treatment for people with autism. Burning, punching, pinching, noxious vapors, things of that nature. And 70% were getting medicine that was interfering with their health and function and mental health and well-being. And it wasn't psychotropic medicine, it was other stuff. What do you suppose was the delay for people with autism if they developed a symptom of a health problem, but they were known to have autism? How long did it take to go from symptom to finally getting the diagnosis of what was causing it? What do you think the average delay was? Well, in our data, it was 9 years. And we should mention again the principle of diagnostic overshadowing. You've heard it many times over the years, which is the tendency to see every single thing a person does as part of their syndrome. Like a fellow that I talked about in another seminar who was vomiting blood, and somebody tried to say that was just manipulative behavior of autism, for example. That's kind of the most extreme form of diagnostic overshadowing, and can cause people to be dismissive and also absolve people of responsibilities when they shouldn't. Particularly famous people who proclaim, I have this illness or I have this developmental syndrome, as though that explains away something. We've got people like Mr. Smith, Mr. He's 43 years old, and he liked being called Mr. Smith, Mr. because that made him Mr. coming and going. All right. He was referred for this abdominal rubbing thing. Always rubbing right at the, base of the sternum, right? This breastbone here. He was always scratching along there, scratching. Well, people were saying that's just an autistic-like mannerism. And we said, well, that might be true, but why would anybody else do that? Well, maybe it's because something hurts there. Maybe there's something going on. And people were so stuck on this is just a task avoidance behavior in a guy with autism that it wasn't until several months later, when he vomited copious amounts of blood and collapsed, that he finally got properly evaluated. And he turned out to have a gigantic ulcer, which occurs much more often in people with autism because of the amount of stress and anxiety they live with all the time. The thing was, and this goes to the other seminar where we talk about mechanisms by which health problems influence a person's behavior. When we said we really need an endoscopy, we need to know what's going on. Does he have reflux? Does he have some kind of inflammation in his stomach or his esophagus? And the answer that we got back was, stomach rubbing doesn't have anything to do with autism. Yeah, that's part of the reason why it's kind of important. Well, stomach rubbing doesn't have anything to do with ulcers either, so forget it. And I'm like, well, think about it for a minute. This guy communicates without speech. How else is he going to tell us? So what are conditions that occur more often in our friends and neighbors and colleagues and teachers who have autism or who are autistic? Unusual types of epilepsy, like we talked about, amygdaloid seizures, limbic seizures. In the seminar on unusual seizures, they talk about these in a lot more detail. PST-related syndromes. And you're saying to yourself, what's a PST, Ruth? I'll tell you in a minute. But what goes along with PSTs are allergies, migraine headaches, digestive issues, not processing foods in the usual way, autoimmune disorders like lupus and rheumatoid and scleroderma and Sjogren's syndrome, or impaired immune functioning. So people that have chronic active infections that don't go away in the usual time frame as they do for others. Anxiety-related conditions such as gastritis, ulcers, accelerated coronary artery disease, extreme stress will cause people to have their coronary artery issues sooner. Allergy-related conditions, further gastrointestinal sensitivities, arthritis, and untreated depression and grief. Now, why would it be particularly high risk that depression and grief would be unaddressed in people with autism? Yeah, it doesn't surprise anybody that's attending this, is that people with autism often don't share the feeling very directly or obviously on the surface. Or if they share it in a way that's unusual, people will misdiagnose that as autistic rather than something else. So you were saying, what's a PST, Ruth? It's a paroxysmal sulfatyltransferase enzyme. Yeah, I know, it's coming back to you. Seriously, this should be a lot more famous than it is. This was research that was done in Europe, and basically links together. If you go through family trees and then do some physiologic studies, it shows that people with autism and their first-degree relatives have a higher risk of paroxysmal sulfatyltransferase enzyme-related conditions. So a mother of a child with autism might have one of the complications, like migraine headaches or gluten sensitivity, and the sibling who doesn't have autism might just have the allergies or the arthritis, and the individual with autism will have 3 or 4 of those complications. Fascinating research. And I'm not sure people have fully defined the mechanism by which this group of metabolic enzymes are altered, but that is a consistent finding. So what does that mean in everyday life? Well, if a person with autism has one of the PST conditions, we should be aware of the possibility of more than one, or even if they're not known to have any PST conditions. I've found it useful in my own clinical practice to screen every person I work with who has autism for all of the PST conditions, because of all those myriad ways they can influence a person's health, well-being, and function. So there's been bits and pieces of remedies and treatments and strategies over the years that have been proposed for people with autism. And you usually have a few stupendous outcome stories, and then larger research studies don't seem to confirm that it really helps all that many people with autism. But this is the important point, isn't it? Just because it doesn't help everybody doesn't mean it can't help somebody. And I have, and I'm sure you have too, seen people where secretin changed their lives. Secretin, which is a intestinal enzyme, is a PST enzyme. And in some people with autism, it appeared to be faulty. And when they received correct secretin, it readjusted their digestive function and improved their lives massively. But it doesn't work for the vast majority of people with autism. So the lesson should be, well, let's not give secretin to everybody. How about we offer secretin to people that have symptoms of abnormal secretin functioning? Well, how do you figure that out? By taking a good look at the person, right? Ask the person. There is a idea out there that everybody with autism should be on a gluten-free, casein-free nutrition plan. Casein, as you know, is the protein in dairy products. And I would say, let's hold off on that. Let's get the answer rather than guessing, because there are blood tests that will tell us every single thing a person might be having a sensitivity to. And if we don't want to do all that, or if the blood tests don't tell us enough, let's be careful. Let's not restrict access to every kind of food on earth. Let's go very deliberately. Let's try some substitutes for dairy milk for a while. How long? Well, to really kind of get an idea if a person's GI tract is going to improve, need about 6 weeks or more, depending on how much injury there is. What you usually see is that within a few days, if there really is a sensitivity, people will start to perk up, they'll feel a little better. But the more impressive improvements take much longer than that, because you're healing injured internal membranes. Migraine headaches are much more common in people with autism for all the reasons we've discussed. And migraine headaches are a PST modulated condition in terms of the effect on the blood vessels. For a while, there was a thought that this very particular combination of megadose vitamins was what people with autism all need to be able to have their best quality of life. And that happened because a few people with autism had a pretty stupendous benefit from megadoses of vitamins. But the lesson, once again, is we can check vitamin levels with tests. We can figure out the answer. And I've had the sad task of telling people that thought they were doing the right thing, that the megadose vitamins were producing permanent neurological injury in their family member with autism. You can get the answer with blood tests. Detoxification of environmental toxins is probably good for all of us. It does seem to be fairly consistent that people with autism clear things in general less well than people who don't have autism. And there's a stupendous researcher, Dr. Martha Herbert at Harvard, who has really done wonderful work in this area. And she believes that people with autism are the people that are telling us just how badly we're treating our environment, because they are becoming sick with what others call ordinary environmental exposures. Immune functioning may or may not be altered. We shouldn't go after a person with a highly restrictive yeast diet or with antifungal medications unless we know they've really got that infection. And wow, for a while, people were saying that immunizations cause autism. And there was an observation that certain people appeared autistic-like after they got their immunizations, and nobody disputes that. It's the middle thing, which is unusual immune function, is common in people with autism and produces a pretty terrible reaction to certain immunizations. So there's now some protocols for safer immunization, and I hope people will be very careful and very thoughtful, because I got to tell you, in this day and age, in the last 5 years, I've diagnosed 3 people with polio. I never expected to see polio, but they got it because they had autism, and they felt like immunization was going to be dangerous. Polio, wow. Who'd have thunk it, right? Medications for people with autism sometimes follow a pattern that seems almost like punishment. High doses of medicines being used for sedating side effects, medicines used in ways they were never intended, which are not really very safe, but not doing the monitoring protocols, and not producing good results. If something's life-saving, that's great, but so often I will end up getting to see people that are on these egregious combinations of very high-dose medicines. Nothing's ever been subtracted, and they're very sick with side effects. But the idea of reducing them is really kind of scary for the people with the individual. The other thing is this idea of this, whatever it was, helped these 3 people with autism. So we have to suddenly offer it to every single person with autism without thinking about, wait, let's get to know these 3 people first. You know, maybe secretin helped them because they come from a family full of people with that particular gastrointestinal illness, not just because they have autism. So again, taking the time it takes to really, really understand. Large quantities of unmonitored supplements and abbreviation of monitoring protocols. Very, very, very big worry. So when you consult with people with autism, and particularly people with the more severe forms of autism who succeed or do well, what do they say are the types of medicines they'd be interested in trying? Usually non-toxic doses of anti-epileptic medications, not Depakote, by the way. We'll talk about Depakote in the seminar on medications. But typically medicines that soothe that deep structure of the brain, the amygdala, the limbic region. Low doses of those medicines can help soothe that part of the brain without impairing the person's ability to function, and in fact improving that person's ability to function. Many people with autism describe a benefit with antidepressants. And medications and carefully selected and monitored supplements based on the person's individual properly diagnosed needs. So what medicines, though, do a lot of people with autism get? Well, often they're getting medicines that are just used to sedate and restrain. Probably the most frequent one, partly because the manufacturers have really pushed it, is Risperdal. It used to be, about 50 years ago it was Mellaril, 40 years ago it was Haldol, and now it's Risperdal. People using some antipsychotic medication, which doesn't confer any therapeutic effect, it's purely for restraint. Alpha blockers, alpha adrenergic hormones are what we think with. And so these medicines, the alpha blockers, they have a dual action. They reduce blood pressure and they also reduce a person's thinking juice, which is really hard when a person needs to function at peak capacity all the time. Same thing with beta blockers, propranolol, metoprolol, atenolol. They suppress beta adrenergic thinking juice. And they also drop blood pressure, slow down the heart, interfere with sleep, which is already hard for people with autism. They knock off between 10 or 20 IQ points, and they slow people down. There was a very popular movement, this is going back about 25 years, where people thought that if you just get the beta blocker dose right, people will be calm and comfortable and like that. The problem is that beta blockers are kind of good for that for about a day or two, but over the long term, they interfere with cognitive function, they interfere with physical function, every physical function, or as one former patient of mine said, Ruth gave me that atenolol and I couldn't get it up ever again. And I said, well, we could fix that. I mean, we better, for goodness sake. And the other thing is that beta blockers suppress the production of melatonin. So they, in fact, make it much, much harder for people to sleep, and people with autism are already dealing with that in a big way. And then unmonitored supplements, some of which are quite poisonous. Whenever I work with a person who wants to take a multivitamin, I implore them to avoid taking vitamins that have chromium and selenium in them. We end up with waves of selenium poisoning when there's a proclamation that selenium makes everybody's prostate happy, which that may be true if you're deficient in selenium, but if you get overdosed with selenium, it affects your body the same way as arsenic. It's very poisonous and can be lethal. Chromium produces a variety of other types of toxic neurological injury. And sadly, there's cycles of everybody thinking that chromium picolinate is going to help them achieve a more perfect body weight. So if we can, we like people who are already thought to have a harder time clearing poisons. We should try and avoid vitamins that include poisons if we can. Antipsychotic medications, so the Haldol, the Risperdal, the Zyprexa, all of those, are specifically designed to reduce the amount of input the brain can perceive. So you can see how if you have schizophrenia and your brain cannot sort incoming stimuli, it can help create a little bit of an artificial filter so that you can focus on what you want to focus on with a little bit less deliberate effort. However, for people with autism, it's just global numbing of incoming stimulation, which is much better and more safely achieved with environmental modifications. And why get so concerned about this? Well, two things. First, the other thing that antipsychotic medications do, this is how they're made, in addition to reducing the amount you can perceive from your environment, they also reduce the brain's ability to respond. So if a person is already anxious and you give them an antipsychotic medication, you cause them to feel like they cannot defend themselves. So a couple layers of stress. And in addition, this is a class of medicines that carries an extremely high risk of permanent neurological damage in people who don't have schizophrenia, who especially severe in people who don't have schizophrenia and do have developmental disabilities, and 3, have co-occurring health problems, which exactly describes the demographic of people. Which is why I implore people to be very, very careful about considering antipsychotic medications, particularly if the person doesn't have a reason to be on them, like they're not having hallucinations. Because environmental modifications and other kinds of supports work better, they produce a better outcome, and they have much less risk to the person in terms of injury. It just doesn't seem fair or safe to drug people into compliance with environments and activities that are of no interest or benefit to the individual. Why would we do that? Doesn't it make more sense to get rid of the fluorescent or other painful lighting? Configure the person's sensory diet to what works for that person. Eliminate expectations that have nothing to do with what the person needs or wants. Spending people's time and energy teaching them certain social rituals that they don't care about and don't really matter in the overall scheme of life, for example. And why do we want to try and make people act like there's somebody else? Why would we do that? The other thing I think is really a mess is what passes for relationship training for a lot of people with autism. Now, because I'm an antique, I've known many, many people with autism who have very successful marriages and other intimate relationships. Very successful, very happy, sustained, productive, all the things you'd like to see in an intimate relationship. And the absolute unifying factor in all those relationships that succeed is that both people like the other one exactly how they are. And what passes for relationship training often tries to teach people social rituals that are unnatural to them and cannot be sustained. There's even, and I learned this from one of the spouses, there's even a hot guys with autism dating service and a hot gals with autism dating service, and so on. So that people know exactly who they are and who they're going to meet and don't have to wade through a bunch of fake stuff. So as we're supporting people with autism, the things that really work according to people with autism are different than a lot of what people try and sell. I think we should be very suspicious. Now, if there's a miracle treatment and it costs $10 billion, I'm all in. Let's pay for it. Let's do it. I'm very cool about that. If a person's selling a miracle, I'm buying, right? It's not about saving money, but it is about doing what works right. So if somebody's selling or telling to do something based on an evaluation that's only ever spent maybe a few minutes in the same room with the individual, I'd be real hesitant about the results of that evaluation. Now, how can clinicians get around that? They can't be everywhere all at once, but they can certainly be looking at a lot of video. They can certainly do Zoom. They can certainly listen to people that know the person in all these environments. And they're going to miss a lot if they don't make use of those technologies. I would be very suspicious of any consultant that says you got to hurt the person to help them. Similarly with drugging people, restraining the people, using checklists instead of unstructured observation, and prescribe a treatment protocol that makes it so the person can't have a life. This idea that 6 hours a day of treatment is good, so 9 hours a day is better, is really, really misguided, because all the really good research, recovery research, says lots and lots of joy and pleasure in your life accelerates growth and recovery. Doesn't interfere, it accelerates it. So what do people with autism say? People with autism who succeed, or people with autism who have not done well, what do they say they needed or wished they'd had? Well, this will sound familiar to those of you that have been in the seminars on recovery. Believe in me. It sounds easier than it is, isn't it? It's people that are persistently optimistic in that person's life. People that know and respect that person's strengths. Even if the strengths are a little paradoxical, like, yeah, that guy knows how to tear down a building in 5 seconds if he needs to. That's not something you want to exactly worship, but it's still something to respect. People with autism very, very consistently report that, hey, we're just like everybody else. We need friends, we need fun, we need love, like anybody else. Medicines should be focused more towards strengthening the person rather than drugging the person into compliance. And keep listening, because what I need changes over time. Successful people with autism have wonderful friendships and romances based on loving and being loved exactly how they are. Often have really unusual sleep patterns, eating habits, and so on. And the less people interfere with that, the more bandwidth the person has available for other parts of life. Most successful people with autism reject most of the well-meant advice they get from neurotypical people. And once you're really friends with a person with autism, you really are friends. And there's nothing greater, because what an adventure to see the world through the eyes of people with autism. Robert is 13 years old, and he's referred because he kept smashing up all the fixtures in his little group home. It was a group home with 2 other kids about the same age and a really nice bunch of staff, and nobody could figure out why he kept destroying the lights and the smoke detectors. And he's not 6.5 feet tall, he's just an average size 13-year-old, but he was amazingly inventive when it turned into the need to destroy things. Oh my goodness, he was an acrobat. And he communicates without speech, attends a school, a special ed school. And people tried all kinds of really pretty inventive ways to make it so he just couldn't destroy these things. They'd have these steel cages over the lights would be way recessed, the smoke detectors would be, microscopic little doodads that nobody could really even see, and none of it worked, man. Robert may have tested with severe intellectual disability and autism, but he was a wizard when it came to destroying all that stuff. So people were like, well, I wonder if there's something to this that has to do with his life. Well, his records were all sanitized. All they got was he was removed from the family at the age of 5, placed in group living situations. Why? It took digging through police reports and fire reports, fire chief reports, because what had happened was his father, who didn't like having a little son with autism, had purposefully miswired a ceiling fan in the attic and left a little dish of gasoline under the ceiling fan, and then locked Robert in the attic with the miswired ceiling fan and a dish of gasoline, with the idea of sparking a fire that would look accidental so he could kill Robert. Robert, being an enormously inventive child, as soon as the fire started, and it was quite explosive, he happened to be in a bathtub that was in the attic, so he didn't get badly burned, but he found a way out and survived this. Well, everybody in the whole world's saying, well, no wonder he's not a big fan of ceiling lights or fire. So in a kind of a brilliant programmatic idea, which was from one of his housemates, not from, of course, us, was, well, why don't we make him the fire chief? And so this was it's this tiny little town where people can do things a lot more creatively. He became kind of an apprentice to an electrician who took him everywhere and watched him wire stuff, and watched him wire stuff the right way. Well, that was amazing. There were a couple of other things, though, that even though they weren't problems, we still probably had to pay attention, right? So this is a dude with autism, so we have to be aware of what? All those PSTs that we talked about? Paroxysmal sulfatyltransferase enzymes. That was a pretty awful house he was living in, and let's take a look. Well, he's got Mies lines in his fingernails. Mies lines are horizontal white lines that can let you know the person is getting toxins. And he had them, and it was assumed that this happened as a result of the awful place he had lived in, because, as you know, once lead gets in a person's system, it can stick there for years and years and years. So he was tested, and sure enough, his lead level was too high. And just to be thorough, they tested the water and all the people that lived there and worked there at this little house. And his housemates didn't have elevated lead levels, but one of his staff, who has a family member with autism, therefore unusual PST enzymes, one of his staff members also had an elevated level of lead. Now, the proper way to treat this poison for him involved an injection, and it would have involved an injection for the staff member as well, except she was utterly, completely, totally petrified of needles. Like she couldn't, no way, no way, no way. Well, he got his injections, and with the lead cleared out of his body, Robert started to speak. And the next thing that happened was that he started speaking to his staff member. Now, she, the one with the elevated lead level that was scared of needles, she had been diagnosed with so-called fibromyalgia, like her whole body ached. It was just miserable. And he said to her, "Laura, how about if I help you get through these injections? I think it'll help you." Not bad for a 15-year-old, huh? So he did. He helped his staff member manage these injections. The lead got out of her system and the fibromyalgia went away. So we start with somebody who's alleged to be just a really destructive kid with autism, and we end up with post-traumatic stress disorder and healing. He also had untreated seizures, and those improved. He also had lead poisoning, and it had been almost 8 years since all these symptoms had started before all of this was finally figured out. And there was still these people over here that were saying, well, you just give him the right fistful of vitamins and he'll be fine. Nah. None of this would have been discovered without individually understanding him. And he ended up being a counselor for other people with autism who'd experienced trauma. So as we look at this business of what's going on in the lives of people with autism, what's going on for people that have a few autistic-like mannerisms, and what else is going on for any of those people, there's always going to be trends. There's always going to be internet stuff. Some of it's really useful, but not all of it. Like Abraham Lincoln said, not everything you read online is true. Thank you very much for your good work, and best wishes as you help more and more people with autism.